Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, why was Doug Jones able to win the U.S. Senate race in Alabama? What were the most important stories locally and nationally in 2017? And what can we look forward to in 2018? Stay tuned. Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by the Dean of Democratic Punditry, Sam Statland. Newly re-elected chairman of the Montgomery County Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher. Former congressional candidate, Liz Matory. And political strategist, Susan Heltemes. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. With a two-seat margin in the U.S. Senate, Republican leaders were eager to protect the seat vacated by Alabama Senator, now Attorney General Jeff Sessions. But the divide between the National Republican Party and the populist wing of the party was on display in the special election to fill the remainder of the term, with the more radical arm of the party seizing the nomination in the primary for former Alabama Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore. Moore, who had a flawed and questionable background, which includes allegations of sexual misconduct with teenage girls, ultimately went down to defeat this past week, handing the seat to the Democrats for the first time in 25 years. Mark, what is the hot take from this election?
I think Republicans take from this that they shouldn't let Steve Bannon pick their U.S. Senate candidates. Reminder, as you know, this was a primary. Trump and the quote-unquote Republican establishment were all lined up against Moore. He was a badly flawed candidate, and even issues versus personality versus character, personality and character can matter a great deal.
And Sam, is there a danger, because Democrats are gleeful that they won this seat, is it danger that they overplay their hand in 2018?
I don't think there's any danger that they'll overplay their hand. My biggest concern is to make sure we have a really, really good game plan, that we have ideas that appeal to people, that are good for the average voter, that rework our tax base, which we're going to have to do after this, quote, reform. And I think the most exciting thing is that this race rebuilt our basic coalitions within the Democratic Party, which I think is going to be wonderful for next year.
Liz, I want to go to you.
Sure.
Here's the thing that, and Sam just touched on this. Obviously, this race demonstrated that there was a re-energized Democratic Party that was ready to come out and ready to come out strong in this election. Isn't that the danger for 2018 for your party?
Not necessarily. I think what we saw in this, and I agree with Mark, is that, this individual, actually my take on this is that if this person had such an issue for the last 35, 40 years, why did that stuff not come about 35, 40 years ago? How did this person have such a long track record of such pervasiveness and then also be able to be in that several different seats? When it comes to the Democratic, strategy, if anything, unfortunately, it's identity politics run amok. There are issues. There are a lot of fraud issues now. There's reports of buses coming from Mississippi, and funnily enough, the absentee ballots that came from military, 98% of them or 90% of them went for the Republican. So at the end of the day, my concern is that outside power is influencing state-specific elections.
Susan, the question I think that I want you to answer is whether or not this is an aberration, because there was such a flawed candidate, and any quote unquote regular Republican would have easily won the seat.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think that voters did say they didn't want his morals in the Senate, but I think the bottom line came down that they were looking after a year of Donald Trump and what they're doing in the White House and in the Congress. And the bottom line came down when any candidate says it doesn't matter what state, that America was the greatest during slavery, we have a problem. And so anybody like that will lose. But the Democrats are getting.
That's your point. That's the point. It's a flawed candidate.
No, you
Susan,
know
we
what,
got to
the
go on to the next.
Democratic
We got to
Party
go on to the
was
next.
organized, they had people on the ground, and they did what we were supposed to do, make phone calls, knock on doors.
$8 million worth of outside
Well,
money
but
organized.
the point is, you were energized in this election, but there was also a flawed candidate in this election. So don't read too much into your success, because as we
That's-
saw
that's what Republicans
in
would hope for.
2016, you underestimate Donald Trump at your own peril. All right, talking about Donald Trump, let's go on to our end of the year wrap up show. What was the biggest national story this year, and who are we going to start with? We're going to start with you, Susan.
It was a year of response to Donald Trump, whether it was the women's marches. It also had to do with the biggest missteps of the administration. And everything this year was responding to him. It got Democrats energized. And one of the things that I think is most important is it got women energized. And that is going to be the future of 2018, Democratic women.
We're talking about 17 now, Susan, but thank you.
In 18.
Donald Trump, Liz,
So,
Donald Trump was the story of 2017.
right.
What's your take on it?
Obviously the opposite, the polar opposite of Susan's, of course. But she mentioned the Women's March, and every other march, if you will, is an example of the allergic reaction that half of the country has taken by an outside candidate taking the entire establishment and putting them on their heels. Especially in this region, a lot of the people never considered Hillary Clinton not being president. And so all of a sudden, you find out next day, oh my gosh, what are you going to do? And my concern, quite frankly, is that the Democratic Party is being so, they'd rather see Donald Trump like unseated than to be concerned about the country at large.
Okay. Mark, what was your take on this 2017 year?
Actually, I think the biggest story was the wave after wave of hurricanes. When you go back and look at the kind of media coverage that we had, that's something that people really paid attention to. It was an unusual year compared, I think you have to go back more than a decade when we had quite so many. The devastation is in the record level, so that probably was the bigger story.
Sam, so is there anything besides politics and natural disaster that we want to talk about tonight?
Well, what I want to, in my opinion, the firing of Comey was the biggest story of the year, because that transcends a lot of things, puts refocuses on the ineptness of Mr. Trump, and shows his lack of appreciation of judicial appointments and the judiciary, which I would think would upset any lawyer in this country.
What do you mean by that, Sam?
Well, our candidate in Alabama was removed from the bench twice for failure to enforce the law.
Well,
That's terrible.
But
And
your point was that Trump didn't have a high regard for the judiciary.
Correct.
But how does that relate to Roy Moore? He didn't select Roy Moore to be on the federal bench.
No, he turned around and supported him.
He supported him for an elective office.
Yes.
After
that way
opposing
his
him in the
background was.
primary.
Well,
now we're finding out all the
What
different
pulled
things.
him through all those years, though, were the evangelicals. And this time around, female evangelicals just said, I may be an evangelical, he may be our candidate, but he's gone
They
too
were split,
far.
50.
all right.
50-50.
So I mean, this is my opportunity to give my take on
Sure.
on 2017, and of course it was Donald Trump was the story of the year, because he has dominated the media cycle on a daily basis through his daily tweets and his daily upset of the Democratic Party. But what's also striking is the fact that the media is playing right into his hands on a daily basis, and by responding to what Trump distractions are all about. He will come out with a tweet, and it'll set off the news cycle for 48 hours, and you will be so dismayed by what he's doing behind the scenes. It's pretty amazing.
I think you eventually reach a tipping point. I think this year, especially at this time, Mr. Trump has reached his tipping point where people who supported him and people who are against him now are motivated, truly motivated, for meaningful change in a balanced way for next year.
But we'll see if obviously, because we're going to talk about that a little later on the show. We'll talk about what's ahead for 2018. But let's focus back on our home state of Maryland. What was the biggest state story this year, Sam? And I'll let you start off.
The startup of the Purple Line, which will give us economic growth in Montgomery and Prince George's County, the biggest economic engines of the state, will create jobs, will allow commerce to expand, will provide housing, provide all types of things. I think that's the biggest story in the county.
Mark.
I think it's the opioid crisis. I think that's something that has touched so many families and communities in on unexpected ways. It has really rippled through, and I think that it's a silent issue that is getting more and more attention that people really care very deeply about. I think that's the real story of the year in Maryland.
Liz.
So we're talking about Maryland or the county?
We're talking about Maryland.
Okay, well, I would say that the debacle of the medical cannabis debacle, the fact that, you know, there's a big controversy on how the licenses were administered. There's not enough growers. There's not enough good product. There's a bottleneck. And we know that the O'Malley administration really only gave the licenses to his political fundraisers. If anything, a lot of the people who receive licenses are from out of state, and now you see prices at upwards of $700 an ounce.
Liz, the final appointments of the growers and the retail outlets occurred during the Hogan administration,
I know,
not
but
during the
however,
O'Malley
come on
administration.
now, the entire
And what you're
the
talking
entire
about
commission-
is
hold on, the entire
stuff that
commission-
goes on
no,
and
the
on and
entire
on
commission-
in this type of
Okay,
situation.
it's my
never-
turn.
It's about price gouging and everybody taking advantage of people who
We're-
are in
this is-
pain and
this
need,
this is kind
you
of
know.
unusual tonight because we're going to let everybody have their own opinion before we respond. So hold on, Sam. Susan, what was the biggest story for this year?
Unease at the state level based on what's happening in Washington. As a result, the legislature gave our Attorney General the right to file cases on behalf of the state of Maryland without the governor's permission, and he did that on a regular basis. There was a lack of response to almost everything on the part of our governor. And finally, the state is picking up issues at the nationals, whether it's the children's health insurance program, they said they would cover it, and paid sick leave that the governor vetoed, but they're going to change the first week in the legislature. So the state is picking up where the feds are, you know.
Isn't that what the state's supposed to do, Susan?
Well, yes, but
I mean, are we supposed to be always dependent on the federal government?
no, but we're one of the few states that are doing that
Just
so
one-
far.
yeah.
We're enlightened, Casey. We're enlightened here in
Well,
Maryland.
what I think is the big story for the state is the continuing homicide rate in the city of Baltimore. It's shocking that we still have a record number of people being murdered on a weekly basis. And this is something that the city of Baltimore has to come to grips with because it is more a regional issue and a local issue than a statewide issue. But still, I think that is the most disturbing story for me that occurred in the state this year. So what's the biggest story in Montgomery County? Susan!
It has to do with public financing options at the county level. And as a result, everybody and their brother and sister and cousin are running for office. And so the sheer number of candidates that we're going to have this next year, incumbents are being challenged, and people have the sense there is a change in the air out there. And so everybody is running.
That's an interesting view on things. So, Sam, what's your story for the county this year?
To picking up a little bit about what Susan's talking about, I really think that term limits, we're seeing the results and the consequences of term limits. We have so many candidates running for so many positions that it's almost impossible to track. And what's truly amazing, especially at the council and executive level, is the few women that are participating in the process when both Republican and Democrats have been encouraging women to run for office.
Thank you, Sam. Mark, what's your take for
You know, I
the
wish
county?
I could disagree, but I have to say that the term limits, the changes, the people running, the retirements of Ike Leggett,
The financing.
the financing. I think I hope that that's not the motivation for all 30 candidates or however many the Democrats have now running at large. But I think that the change in leadership that has been set up because of this turnover is a big story that we'll certainly be talking about in 2018 as well.
Liz?
Well, I was going to talk about the massive amounts of machete incidents and the tearing of hearts out of people coming from the unlawful entrance, illegal aliens, and MS-13 and the gang activity that has been upsurged. But I would rather talk about the fact that our county is running out of money because they don't want to admit the fact that there's a huge gouge of our coffers. I don't know how these new people are going to address that because honestly, they're just churning out the same people from the same party. And it's also, you know, the term limit that we worked aggressively on, not only as Republicans, as independents, and quite many Democrats, because don't forget the establishment was against term limits.
Well, I think the issue, you're pointing out that the economic issues is a big one because it shows a dangerous lack of projections. That when you assume that the rich just didn't pay enough because they were waiting for their capital gains to come in the following year, I think that's an unrealistic thing. I think, again, it shows that there's a fundamental flaw in how we are doing our revenue stream. All right, so let's go right on into what we're going to look forward to in the year ahead. What will be the most important story nationally in 2018? Sam?
Why, the impeachment of Donald Trump, of course. What other story can there be? I think, going back to
You don't
Cummings
want to
has put him
impeach
in
him.
such a situation.
You need a pinata.
He's becoming
You need a
untenable.
pinata. You would hate Mike
Well,
Pence.
thanks for the
You would hate
softball.
Mike Pence.
You threw the ball and I hit it.
You would hate Mike Pence. No, that was a foul ball. You missed. You whiffed. That was a curveball. Susan, what's the biggest story for 2018?
There are two. It's will this enthusiasm on the voters continue and will people be excited? But I think the one that is going to probably be the most interesting is the Republicans have now done tax reform. It appears that it is going to pass, but in the process, there's way too much of a debt, far, far, far more than they want to admit. And as a result, in the new year, there is going to be entitlement reform. Entitlement reform of such things as Medicare and Social Security. I wouldn't call them an entitlement, but Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are going to be out there. And if we don't get it done this year, I think CHIPS, the Children's Health Insurance Program, is also going to be gone.
Well, you're just full of good news, aren't you? Liz, what's your story for 2018?
Well, quite frankly, I think that finally, in 2018, we can actually address the explosion of big government. Unfortunately, not only did Obama, but also before him, Bush second grew our federal government to a point where it's insurmountable. I also am looking forward to, quite frankly, the degradation more of the Democratic Party. In order for them to, answer to the Trump effect, they're going to skew even far more left than they've ever been. And we're going to lose all moderate Democrats in the process. So I look forward to seeing it and look forward to the fact that there are going to be more people running for office.
Well, so that means you and Susan kind of agree because you want voter enthusiasm in 2018. Mark, what is your take on things?
I think we're hearing the polarization that's going on in this country, and I expect it to continue. I think that people are less believing, or have less credibility attached to the media. And I think that's fundamentally changing the way people respond to events because they just don't believe it. We saw that in Alabama with the response to the Post. They felt that this was a biased newspaper and they just didn't believe what was in the Post.
But he did lose.
But he did lose. But my point is we're seeing this polarization in the society and it will continue through next November.
But what
You
you'll
are
see
so right.
is
Now, Sam,
the
we got-
traditional bloc of the Democratic Party
Sam,
in
do this quickly.
in the cities
You're talking
and in
black
urban
people?
areas
You're talking about black
coalescing, coming together.
people voting
Wait a
for
minute, we're not
Democrats.
No, I think
look,
I just
yeah.
increased
We're-
vote.
I'm
We
wondering
gotta
what the
keep going.
traditional
We got-
votes
There's
guys,
are.
Hispanic,
Who-
there's
Sam,
Ethiopian,
Sam,
there's
Sam.
Okay,
all
and
kinds of
got-
other
Sam.
those
people
two are a
there
lot more conservative.
supporting.
Gotta keep going.
So you
the
base
Democrats.
identity
We gotta
politics.
keep going.
Congratulations.
You know,
Go Debs, go Debs.
all right, you go.
You will die.
You be a cheerleader. That's
The party
fine.
will die.
What's going to be the most important story in Maryland in 2018? Mark,
We got a fundamental change, and we've heard this difference, and we heard it. We're going to the committee Montgomery breakfast between different governing philosophies. Larry Hogan came to office with a very clear idea of what the role of government was, what was going to make this state more competitive. What we're hearing is an effort to go back to the way things were under Martin O'Malley, with more spending and more mass transit and more of the kind of policies that got us in trouble.
we got to do this quick. We have about 1 minute left. Sam, what's the biggest story in Maryland 2018?
Trying to recover our budget shortfalls. We have to rework the budget, so we're in trouble.
Susan?
The Me Too movement is coming to Maryland, and I have heard that there are people in the House and Senate on both sides that are going to be in trouble as they run for office this next year.
Liz, quickly.
The re-election of Larry Hogan, seeing the fact that everybody in the state is very much welcoming the economic upsurge of our state.
When we come back from this short break, I think we'll keep going on more for the future of 2018. Stay tuned. And welcome back. You know, we need an hour to do the end of the year show because we just breezed through a half hour so quickly. We didn't even get predictions for what's going to happen in Montgomery County in 2018. But now it's time for parting shots. We're going to start with Susan Heltemes. Your parting shot, your last one for 2017. Make it good, Susan.
The Merriam-Webster word of the year this year is feminism. And I think that the Alabama race shows that when women overwhelmingly made the difference. And it is going to make a difference in Maryland and I think across the state. Part of it is a response to all the bad things that are going on, and finally women are talking about the oppression and the harassment. And as a result, I think that is going to help right here in Montgomery County, because I'm convinced that the next county executive of Montgomery County will be none other than Rose Krasna. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah to all. May 2018 bring us peace and sanity.
Thank you, Susan. Sam Statland, your parting shot for 2017.
Today's the day I really knocked President Trump. And I guess what impacted upon me the most was when it comes to the judiciary and making appointments to the bench of people who have never been in court, either tried a case or brought a case. How do you have a judge sitting on the bench that has no idea of what it's like to represent or prosecute people? And this effect will go for years as long as these people are appointed. And I think it really does a disservice to all of us in this country who believe in the Constitution and the American way. And a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all.
Well, on that
Cheery.
Ooh, boy.
on that cheery note, Mark Uncapher, what's your parting shot for 2017?
Sure. Last Sunday, the Montgomery County Republican Party had its annual Toys for Tots party, and I have to say we've been doing this for almost a decade, but I'm pleased to say and thankful to say that among our supporters we were able to have the biggest haul of toys that we've had for many, many years, and I'd just like to thank the people who all made that possible.
Thank you, Mark. Liz Matory, your parting shot for 2017.
Well, I look forward to the further dismantling of the deep state and the establishment. I think finally American citizens are waking up to how people have been, taken advantage of for way too long. And 2018 is going to be another great year to see, actually inside Beltway folks lose their stuff because they have no idea how to get their, mortgages paid by all the lobbying they're going to lose out on. So I'm looking forward to that.
Well, thank you, Liz. I actually have a rather mixed parting shot for 2017. I've been amazed by the political cacophony that we've heard throughout the entire year. And I'm fascinated by the fact that the Democrats just have such great animus towards the president of Donald Trump. It transcends anything that I've ever seen in my 65 years on this earth. But what also strikes me is that we do have a division within our country between between urban areas and rural areas, and that realization is kind of hard to accept. I wish we were more together as a country. I'm actually very hopeful for 2018 for the economy. I think the economy is taking off. I think it's going to be a very, very robust economic climate. And I think that's hopeful for us all because I think a rising tide, brings all boats up. So I'm very happy. 2018 is going to be more chaos on the political scene than we saw in 2018 as it gets more strident as we come towards elections. But I think we're going to have a positive year economically. For 21 this week, I want to thank everybody being here, and I want to wish the same spirit of good cheer and goodwill that Susan expressed earlier and that we all have towards one another and towards our viewers. We welcome you to come back and see us in January when we come back from this short winter hiatus. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.